If you think your childhood was tough, imagine being taken from your family at 7, starved on purpose, and beaten just for being caught stealing bread. Welcome to Sparta. Tonight, on Time to Sleep History, we'll drift through the shadowy corridors of ancient Sparta and explore what it was really like to grow up in a society that raised children to be weapons. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how many of us are drifting into sleep from every corner of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe get comfortable under the covers, and let's ease into this story of survival, strength, and strange rituals. Because in Sparta, the trials began not at 7, but with the very first breath of life. Picture a newborn's first moments in ancient Sparta, where the air fills not with gentle lullabies or whispered blessings, but with the hushed voices of elders examining every limb and muscle. The baby's cries echo against stone walls as the council of elders turns the tiny body this way and that, searching for signs that will determine whether this child sees another sunrise. In most places across the ancient world, birth brought celebration, gifts, and prayers for the child's future happiness. But in Sparta, it brought inspection, measurement, and the cold possibility of judgment. Imagine the terror that gripped new parents as they watched strangers handle their newborn with the detached interest of livestock inspectors. The mother, still weak from labor, could only lie there as the council of elders passed judgment on her child's right to exist. The father stood silent, knowing that any protest would be seen as weakness, any emotional display as unfitting for a Spartan citizen. Their love, their hopes, their natural desire to protect their offspring counted for nothing in this moment. The state's needs towered above parental instinct, and the state needed only the strongest. The elders examined each infant's body with practiced eyes, looking for the subtle signs that might compromise a future warrior's effectiveness. They checked the straightness of limbs, the clarity of eyes, the strength of the infant's cry. A slightly curved spine might mean weakness in battle. A birthmark could signal divine displeasure. Even the way the baby moved its arms and legs came under scrutiny, as if these tiny gestures could predict battlefield prowess decades in the future. Every detail mattered because every detail could mean the difference between a citizen and a liability. This wasn't cruelty in their eyes, though it would seem monstrous to us now. The Spartan elders saw themselves as gardeners, carefully selecting which seedlings deserved precious water and soil. They lived in a world where enemies pressed against their borders, where military weakness meant not just defeat but slavery for their entire people. In their harsh calculation, it was better to sacrifice the weak at birth than to risk the strong in battle later. They convinced themselves that mercy to the individual was cruelty to the community. Parents had no say in this process, no right to argue or bargain for their child's life. The bond between mother and child, so sacred in other cultures, became irrelevant before the state's cold logic. Fathers who had proven themselves in battle could only stand helplessly as their offspring faced judgment from men who had never held this particular baby, never felt its heartbeat against their chest, never looked into its eyes and seen their own mortality reflected back. The very love that should have protected the child became a dangerous emotion that needed to be suppressed. Infants judged unfit were left to exposure, a practice recorded only by Plutarch centuries later and now debated by historians. Some infants may have been exposed on a hillside, though archaeological evidence for infant remains on Mount Taygetus is lacking. Others might have been given to families in neighboring communities, removed from Spartan society but allowed to live. The exact fate of these rejected children remains shrouded in the mists of time, but their absence from Spartan records tells its own story of lives deemed unworthy of documentation. What emerges clearly from the historical record is that from the very first breath, Spartan children belonged not to their families, but to the state. The moment of birth began a lifetime of service that would end only in death. These newborns were not individuals with their own destinies to pursue, but resources to be managed, tools to be sharpened, weapons to be forged. Their personal happiness, their individual dreams, their private longings would always come second to the collective need for military strength. The psychological impact of this system extended far beyond the examination room. Parents learned to hold their affection at arm's length, knowing that their children might be taken from them at any moment. They could not allow themselves to love too deeply, to dream too specifically, to hope too personally. The state's claim on their children was absolute, and emotional attachment would only make the inevitable separations more painful. This created a society where even the most intimate relationships carried the chill of potential loss. The initial judgment set the tone for an entire childhood where individual worth was measured only by potential service to Sparta. Children who survived the first inspection would face constant evaluation throughout their youth, their value to the state assessed and reassessed as they grew. They learned early that their existence was conditional, that their right to live depended on their ability to serve. This knowledge shaped every aspect of their development, creating young people who saw themselves not as individuals, but as extensions of state power. Even those who passed the initial inspection carried with them the knowledge that others had not been so fortunate. They grew up understanding that their society valued strength above all else, that weakness was not just undesirable but potentially fatal. This created children who learned to hide their vulnerabilities, to suppress their fears, to present themselves as harder and stronger than they might naturally be. The spectre of that first judgment haunted them throughout their lives. The system created a terrible irony where the very people meant to protect children became their first threat. The elders who examined newborns were often grandfathers themselves, men who had once faced the same scrutiny, who had seen their own children subjected to the same cold evaluation. Yet they performed their duty with the same detached professionalism, having learned to separate their personal feelings from their civic obligations. The cycle of judgment perpetuated itself across generations. As you settle into your comfortable bed tonight, consider how different your first moments must have been from those Spartan infants. You were likely welcomed with tears of joy, held close by parents who saw in you not a future soldier, but a precious individual worthy of love, simply for existing. Your worth was never questioned, your right to life never debated by strangers with cold eyes and harsh calculations. For those who survived this initial judgment, the real trials were yet to come. They would enjoy just 7 short years of family life before facing another moment of separation that would prove even more devastating. The first breath of judgment was merely the beginning of a lifetime where individual humanity would be systematically stripped away in pursuit of military perfection. And when that 7th birthday arrived, the state would come calling once again, this time not for inspection, but for permanent collection. Close your eyes and imagine being 7 years old, playing in your family's courtyard under the warm Mediterranean sun, when the sound of heavy footsteps echoes through your home. The official paidonomos and irons appear at your door, their faces stern and unmoved by the tears that begin to well in your mother's eyes. They have come for you, and there will be no negotiation, no delay, no gentle transition. Your childhood ends in this moment, as abruptly as a candle flame snuffed out by an unexpected wind. The toys scattered around your feet suddenly seem like relics from another lifetime, meaningless objects that belong to a boy who will cease to exist by sunset. At age 7, every Spartan boy faced the most traumatic transition imaginable, separation from everything familiar, loving, and safe. Unlike other Greek cities where boys might gradually spend more time away from home, learning trades or studying with tutors while still returning each evening to their mother's embrace, Spartan separation was immediate cane, and absolute. There would be no visits home, no familiar faces waiting with comfort after a difficult day, no gentle words to ease the fear that gripped their small hearts. The agoge system demanded complete severance from family bonds, viewing parental love not as natural affection but as weakness that needed to be crushed before it could take root and compromise of future warriors. Effectiveness. The march to the communal barracks must have felt like a funeral procession for childhood itself. Boys were led through the streets they had known all their lives, past the homes where they had played, past the market stalls where their mothers had bought them treats, past the familiar corners where they had hidden during games of chase. Now they walked in silence, surrounded by other boys their age, all sharing the same bewildered terror, but none daring to show it. The paidonomos who escorted them showed no more emotion than men herding livestock. their faces revealing nothing of what awaited these children in their new lives. The barracks themselves offered no comfort to ease this transition. Boys would sleep on hard beds made of reeds. They gathered themselves from the banks of the Eurotas River, their small fingers learning to weave together the coarse plant material that would serve as their mattress. The reeds were scratchy and provided little cushioning against the stone floors, but complaints were not tolerated. Each boy had to construct his own sleeping space, a task that taught self-reliance while reinforcing their separation from the soft beds and gentle care they had known at home. Their new family consisted of older boys who saw them as targets for hazing and brutal initiation rituals. These older children, themselves products of the same harsh system, had learned to view newcomers not as frightened children deserving compassion, but as weak links that needed to be strengthened through cruelty. The 7-year-olds were organized into groups called agli, essentially packs of boys who would eat, sleep, and train together under the supervision of an older boy called an iron. This older boy, chosen by his peers for his toughness and leadership qualities, held absolute authority over the younger children, and was expected to maintain discipline through whatever means necessary. The state believed that only by destroying the child's previous identity could they forge the perfect warrior. The padonomos oversaw the entire system with the cold efficiency of farmers managing their livestock. These men understood that the bonds between parent and child represented the greatest threat to their program. As long as boys remembered their mother's lullabies or their father's proud smiles, they would remain individuals with personal loyalties that might conflict with absolute devotion to Sparta. The solution was to replace these memories with new ones. Memories of shared hardship, collective struggle, and the bitter satisfaction of survival. Homesickness wasn't just discouraged, it was beaten out of them through systematic psychological conditioning. Boys who cried for their mothers faced immediate punishment, not just from their supervisors, but from their peers who had learned that showing weakness brought consequences for the entire group. The tears that came naturally to frightened children were redefined as shameful displays of character defects that needed to be eliminated. Boys learned to swallow their sobs, to hide their fear behind masks of stoic indifference, to transform their longing for home into anger at their own perceived weakness. The physical conditions of their new life reinforced this psychological transformation. Beginning at age 12, boys received only one item of clothing per year, a single cloak that had to serve as shirt, jacket, and blanket regardless of weather conditions. They walked barefoot year-round, their feet gradually toughening against stones and thorns until they felt no pain. The cold mountain air that swept through the barracks at night became their constant companion, teaching them that comfort was a luxury they could never again expect to enjoy. Sleep brought no respite from the harsh realities of their new existence. Boys huddled together for warmth on their reed beds, but even this basic human comfort was carefully regulated. They were taught to sleep lightly, always ready to respond to commands or defend against attacks from other groups. The peaceful dreams of childhood were replaced by the vigilant half-sleep of soldiers, a state of constant readiness that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The older boys who supervised them had themselves been shaped by this same system just a few years earlier. They had learned that mercy was weakness, that kindness was dangerous, that survival required the elimination of all soft emotions. When they looked at the new arrivals, they saw not children who deserved protection, but potential failures, who needed to be tested until they either hardened into proper Spartans or revealed themselves as unworthy of team. Continued existence. The cycle of cruelty perpetuated itself as each generation of survivors became the tormentors of the next. This forced separation marked the beginning of a childhood where emotional bombs were seen as dangerous vulnerabilities that could compromise military effectiveness. Boys learned to trust only in their own strength, to depend only on their ability to endure pain, to find comfort only in the knowledge that they were becoming something harder and more terrible than ordinary human beings. The gentle connections that bind families together were systematically severed, replaced by the harsh bonds of shared suffering and collective purpose. Yet even as these boys struggled to adapt to their new reality, they would soon discover that the loss of family warmth was only the beginning. The padonomos had designed their program with careful precision, understanding that breaking the spirit required more than just isolation. As the boys settled into their reed beds on that first night, their empty stomachs would soon teach them that in Sparta, even the most basic human needs would become tools of instruction. The deliberate hunger that followed was unlike anything these boys had ever experienced. Imagine your stomach cramping with pain that gnaws at you from the inside, but knowing that this suffering was intentional, carefully crafted by the very people who claimed to care for your development. The empty feeling that spreads through your belly isn't an accident or oversight. It's a lesson written in the language of deprivation, designed to make you desperate enough to steal, cunning enough to survive, and hard enough to endure what ordinary children could never bear. Spartan boys weren't just underfed by accident or neglect. Starvation was a deliberate educational tool, as carefully planned as their weapons training or physical conditioning. As documented by Xenophon in his Constitution of the Lacedaemonians, the authorities who designed the agoge understood that a well-fed boy might grow soft, might begin to expect comfort, might develop the dangerous belief that his needs mattered more than his duty. They provided just enough food to keep the boys alive and functional, but never enough to satisfy their growing bodies or ease the constant reminder of their vulnerability. The cruel irony embedded in this system was that stealing food was not only encouraged but expected, yet getting caught meant brutal punishment that could leave a boy bloodied and broken. According to Xenophon's account, theft was tolerated as part of their training, but only if they avoided detection. Being caught resulted in severe beatings. You had to become skilled enough to take what you needed without being seen, smart enough to identify the best opportunities, and careful enough to avoid the watchful eyes of those who would punish you for the very behavior they had forced you to adopt. They received just enough food to survive, forcing them to develop cunning and stealth to supplement their meager rations. The official meals consisted of basic fair barley bread, cheese, and the infamous black broth that even other Greeks found revolting. But these portions were deliberately insufficient for growing boys who spent their days in intense physical training. The gap between what they received and what they needed created a constant state of hunger that drove them to extraordinary measures. This wasn't about teaching them to be thieves in the common sense. It was about making them resourceful and fearless in the face of scarcity. The state wanted soldiers who could function effectively even when supply lines were cut, who could find sustenance in hostile territory, and who understood that survival often depended on taking what you needed rather than waiting for what you were given. The boys who mastered this skill would later become the backbone of Spartan military operations, capable of sustaining themselves during long campaigns where other armies would starve. Boys would raid gardens under cover of darkness, sneak into kitchens when servants were busy elsewhere, and compete with each other for scraps, all while maintaining their rigorous training schedule. The vegetable gardens of Sparta became hunting grounds where small figures crept between rows of crops, filling their stomachs with raw vegetables and fruit that tasted sweeter than any feast. They learned which houses had the most careless cooks, which storage rooms were poorly guarded, and which neighbors were most likely to leave food unattended. The psychological conditioning went deeper than mere hunger. Boys learned to view abundance with suspicion, to see a full belly as a sign of moral corruption that would weaken their resolve. When they occasionally received adequate food, they felt uncomfortable and guilty, as if they were betraying their training by allowing themselves such luxury. This mental programming would stay with them throughout their lives, creating adult men who remained suspicious of comfort and who equated deprivation with virtue. Hunger became their constant companion, shaping every decision and teaching them that comfort was weakness. The empty feeling in their stomachs served as a continuous reminder of their dependence on the state, their vulnerability as individuals, and their need to prove themselves worthy of survival. They measured time not by the sun's position but by the rhythm of their hunger, planning their days around the few official meals and the opportunities for supplementing their rations. The competition for food created additional layers of complexity in their relationships with each other. Boys had to balance cooperation with competition, sharing information about food sources while also protecting their own discoveries. They formed temporary alliances for difficult raids, then competed fiercely for the spoils. This taught them the delicate balance between individual survival and group cohesion that would define their military careers. Through systematic starvation, Sparta created boys who viewed deprivation as normal and abundance as suspicious. They developed an almost supernatural ability to function on minimal resources, to find sustenance where others would see only empty cupboards, and to maintain their strength and focus even when their bodies cried out for nourishment. The hunger that had once tormented them became a source of strength, a reminder of their own toughness and their ability to survive what would destroy softer men. The physical effects of chronic hunger marked their bodies as clearly as any battle scar. They remained lean and wiry throughout their youth, their muscles developing without the softening layer of fat that adequate nutrition would have provided. Their faces carried the sharp angles of constant hunger, their eyes the bright intensity of those who had learned to compete for every scrap of sustenance. But hunger was just one of many tools used to forge their bodies into weapons of war. As these boys learned to ignore the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs, they would soon discover that their instructors had other methods of teaching them to disregard their physical needs entirely. The physical conditioning that followed transformed pain from something to be avoided into something to be embraced. Picture a world where every mistake brought physical punishment, where bruises were badges of learning and the crack of a whip served as punctuation in daily lessons. You wake each morning knowing that pain waits somewhere in the hours ahead, though you never know which moment will bring it crashing down upon you. The instructors move through the training grounds like storm clouds, their faces revealing nothing of their intentions, their hands always close to the leather straps and wooden rods that hang from their belts. In Sparta, violence wasn't abuse in the way we might understand it today. It was pedagogy, a systematic approach to hardening young minds and bodies through the deliberate application of physical discipline. The men who administered these beatings saw themselves as craftsmen, shaping raw human material into something useful and strong. They had learned their methods from their own instructors, who had in turn learned from theirs, creating an unbroken chain of suffering that stretched back through generations. Each blow was calculated, each punishment measured against the lesson it was meant to teach. Instructors used whips, sticks, and fists to teach lessons that extended far beyond academic subjects, embedding knowledge directly into muscle memory through repetition and punishment. When you failed to hold your shield at the proper angle, the sting of leather against your arm taught you more effectively than any verbal instruction. When you showed fear during a wrestling match, the instructor's rod across your back reminded you that courage was not optional. The physical pain became associated with specific mistakes, creating pathways in the brain that linked error with consequence in ways that mere words could never achieve. Pain was meant to teach them that their bodies were merely tools of the state, not sources of personal comfort or pleasure. You learn to view your flesh as you might view a sword or shield, something to be maintained and strengthened for its utility rather than cherished for its own sake. The natural human desire for physical comfort was systematically trained out of you, replaced by an understanding that your body's primary purpose was service to Sparta. When you felt cold, you learned not to seek warmth, but to appreciate the toughening effect of exposure. When you felt hungry, you learned not to crave food, but to value the discipline that came with deprivation. They learned to endure suffering silently, viewing any cry of pain as a shameful display of weakness that diminished their worth as future warriors. The first natural response to pain is to voice it, to cry out or whimper or call for help. But these boys discovered that such expressions only brought more punishment, more shame, and the disappointed looks of instructors who expected better. You learn to bite your tongue, to clench your jaw, to transform the energy of pain into something internal rather than external. The silence became a form of victory, a way of proving that you were stronger than your own body's protests. The annual cheese-stealing ritual at Artemis Orthia involved boys being whipped until they bled as crowds gathered to witness their endurance. This ceremony, known as the diamastigosis, transformed suffering into spectacle, making public displays of the private pain that filled their daily lives. According to Plutarch's account in his Life of Lycurgus, you stood at the altar knowing that leather whips would soon tear your flesh, that blood would flow down your back, that the watching crowd would judge your worth by how long you could stand without falling. The boys looked forward to this annual test, seeing it as an opportunity to prove their strength and win recognition for their endurance. This wasn't sadism or cruelty for its own sake. It was systematic conditioning designed to remove the natural human fear of pain and injury that might compromise a warrior's effectiveness in battle. The instructors who administered these beatings understood that soldiers who flinched at the prospect of pain would hesitate at crucial moments, that warriors who feared injury would fail to press attacks when success required sacrifice. They were creating men who could function effectively even when wounded, who could continue fighting despite bleeding, who could lead charges into enemy spears without the self-preservation instincts that protected but also limited ordinary human beings. Through constant physical punishment, Sparta created boys who viewed their own suffering as irrelevant to their duty, men who could set aside personal pain in service of larger purposes. You learned that your individual comfort mattered less than your unit's success, that your personal welfare was secondary to the state's needs. The pain that had once seemed overwhelming became simply another environmental factor to be managed, like cold or hunger or fatigue. You developed the ability to compartmentalize suffering, to acknowledge its existence without allowing it to influence your actions or decisions. The physical conditioning was only one aspect of their education, though perhaps the most visible to outside observers. Yet even as their bodies were being hardened through systematic discipline, their minds were being shaped in equally deliberate ways. The same state that had decided their bodies belonged to Sparta would soon determine what thoughts were permitted to occupy their developing intellects. Imagine sitting in a classroom where reading and writing were afterthoughts, where the only literature that mattered was the poetry of war, and the only stories worth telling were those of glorious death in battle. The wooden tablets before you hold, not the philosophical musings that captivated other Greek cities, but simple military commands scratched into wax with crude styluses. Your fingers trace the basic letters that spell out formations and orders, while your mind yearns for something more, something deeper than the endless repetition of tactical knowledge. Yet you know that such yearning is dangerous, a sign of the very softness that your instructors work tirelessly to eliminate from your developing character. While other Greek cities celebrated intellectual achievement and competed to produce the finest philosophers, poets, and mathematicians, Sparta viewed traditional education with deep suspicion and active hostility. In Athens, boys your age would be learning geometry, studying the works of Homer for their literary merit, and engaging in debates about justice and virtue. They would spend their days in gymnasiums that served as centers of learning, where physical training was balanced with intellectual development. But in Sparta, such pursuits were seen as corrupting influences that would weaken the warrior spirit and introduce dangerous ideas about individual worth and personal fulfillment. The tension between what you might naturally crave and what the state demanded created a constant internal struggle. Spartan boys learned only enough letters for marching orders. Advanced literacy was regarded as unnecessary or dangerous. The ability to decipher basic commands was necessary for military effectiveness, but beyond that minimal literacy lay territory that the state considered dangerous. You practiced falling letters with the same mechanical precision you used to thrust a spear, understanding that both skills served the same ultimate purpose. Yet sometimes, in quiet moments between training sessions, you wondered what secrets those forbidden books might contain, what thoughts might flourish in minds allowed to wander beyond the narrow confines of military necessity. Their literature consisted of war songs, tales of heroic deaths, and speeches designed to glorify sacrifice for the state, creating a cultural landscape as barren as a battlefield stripped of vegetation. The stories passed down through generations focused relentlessly on warriors who died well, mothers who sent their sons to battle with fierce pride, and the glory that came from choosing death over dishonor. These narratives served as both entertainment and instruction, reinforcing the values that the state wanted to embed in young minds. You learned to recite these tales with the same precision you brought to weapon drills, understanding that they were not mere stories but templates for your own future actions. The lack of significant literary output from Sparta stands in stark contrast to the rich cultural productions of other Greek communities. While Athens and other cities produced works that would influence human thought for millennia, Sparta's contribution to literature remained deliberately limited. Only two notable early lyric poets emerged from their culture, and even their works focused primarily on military themes and state loyalty. The sparse production of inscribed documents reflects not illiteracy, but a conscious choice to limit the written word to practical necessities. Books were viewed as potential sources of dangerous ideas that might lead young minds astray from their appointed path of service. Critical thinking was discouraged because questioning minds might question orders or the righteousness of their cause, and such questioning represented the greatest threats to military discipline. The state understood that soldiers who wondered about the justice of their wars might hesitate at crucial moments, that warriors who considered alternative approaches to conflict might fail to follow commands with the blind obedience that victory required. Your instructors watched carefully for signs of intellectual curiosity, ready to redirect your attention back to approved subjects whenever your mind began to wander into forbidden territory. Questions about tactics were acceptable, but questions about the purpose of warfare itself were quickly suppressed. They were taught to speak in brief, sharp phrases using the famous laconic style that wasted no words on nuance or emotion, their very language shaped to serve military efficiency. The term laconic itself comes from Laconia, the region surrounding Sparta, and reflects the cultural value placed on concise communication. You learn to express complex ideas in the fewest possible words, to communicate with maximum impact using minimal language. This wasn't merely a stylistic choice, but a tool of social control, a way of discouraging the kind of elaborate discourse that might lead to questioning or debate. Your words became weapons, sharp and precise, designed to convey information rather than explore possibilities. Philosophy, mathematics, and art were actively discouraged as distractions from the only subjects that truly mattered: warfare and obedience. The Spartan leadership believed that these pursuits could undermine the focus and discipline required of a warrior, introducing ideas and perspectives that might compromise military effectiveness. While other Greek cities celebrated artistic achievement and intellectual accomplishment, Sparta viewed such pursuits with suspicion. You learned that time spent on mathematics was time stolen from weapon training, that energy devoted to artistic creation was energy better spent on physical conditioning. The state's needs took precedence over any individual desire for creative expression or intellectual exploration. Their minds were being deliberately limited, shaped into tools as narrow and sharp as their spears, designed for a single purpose and stripped of any capacity for broader understanding. This intellectual limitation wasn't an accident or oversight, but a carefully planned aspect of their education. The state wanted warriors who could execute orders without question, who could focus entirely on military objectives without being distracted by competing values or alternative visions of human balsen, flourishing. Your mind became a weapon, honed to serve a specific function and deliberately prevented from developing the kind of broad understanding that might lead to dissatisfaction with your assigned role. This deliberate limitation of intellectual horizons created a generation of warriors who could fight brilliantly, but couldn't imagine alternatives to their harsh existence. The system produced men who excelled at their designated function, but remained trapped within the narrow confines of their training. You learned to see the world through the lens of military necessity, to evaluate all experiences based on their contribution to warrior effectiveness. The possibility of a different kind of life, one that valued beauty, creativity, or intellectual achievement, became literally unthinkable. Yet even this systematic destruction of intellectual curiosity was only preparation for something far darker. Beyond the official training lay a hidden curriculum that would complete their transformation from children into something else entirely, a secret education that took place under cover of darkness and left stains that could d'appareil, never be washed clean. In the dead of night, older boys would slip away on missions that would haunt them forever, disappearing into the darkness like ghosts carrying secrets too terrible for daylight. The cryptia, Sparta's most shameful secret, unfolded under cover of darkness when the moon was thin and shadows provided perfect concealment. You would rise from your reed bed without a sound, your bare feet finding the cold stone floor as you prepared for duties that had no name in polite conversation. The other boys sleeping around you knew where you were going, but none spoke of it, understanding that some truths were too dangerous to acknowledge aloud. Your heart would pound as you gathered your weapons, not from fear of physical danger, but from the weight of what you were about to do to another human being. This hidden curriculum crossed the line from harsh education into systematic murder, a program so disturbing that even ancient sources spoke of it in whispers. The crypteia represented the final stage of Spartan conditioning, the moment when young men proved they had successfully transformed from children into instruments of state terror. This wasn't part of the regular agoge that other Greek cities might grudgingly respect as harsh but necessary military training. This was something darker, a ritual that revealed the true nature of Spartan society and the lengths to which it would go to maintain its grip on power. Modern scholars debate whether the crypteia was a universal rite of passage or limited to elite young men, but the institution's existence remains documented in ancient sources. The crypteia involved young Spartans hunting and killing helots, particularly those suspected of rebellion or showing signs of independence, turning the countryside into a hunting ground where human beings became prey dull. According to Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus and Xenophon's accounts, these operations targeted helots who posed potential threats to Spartan security. The helots were not foreign enemies or dangerous criminals, but the descendants of Greeks who had been conquered and enslaved by earlier generations of Spartans. They worked the fields that fed the city, built the houses where citizens lived, and performed the countless tasks that kept Spartan society functioning. Many had families, children who looked up to them, communities that depended on their labor and care. This wasn't warfare against enemies with weapons and armor who could fight back on equal terms. It was the cold-blooded assassination of defenseless people whose only crime was existing in a state that viewed their very survival as a threat to social order. The helots targeted by the crypteia were often traveling alone between villages, working in isolated fields, or simply going about their daily lives without any protection or warning. They carried no weapons, wore no armor, and had no training in combat that might have given them a chance to defend themselves. The young Spartans who stalked them held every advantage: superior training, better weapons, the element of surprise, and the backing of state authority that made their actions legal rather than criminal. Boys were taught to view helots as less than human, dangerous animals that needed to be culled to prevent rebellion and maintain the natural order that kept Sparta strong. This dehumanization was essential to the psychological conditioning that made the crypteia possible. You learned to see the people you hunted not as individuals with hopes and fears, but as potential threats to everything you had been taught to value. The state's propaganda painted helots as naturally rebellious, inherently violent, and constantly plotting against their masters. The young men of the crypteia were taught to believe that their actions were preventive, that they were protecting innocent Spartan citizens from future harm. They would hide in the countryside during daylight hours, ambushing helots who were traveling alone or working in isolated fields, turning the peaceful landscape into a theater of violence. You learned to read the patterns of helot movement, to identify the paths they used between villages, the times when they would be most vulnerable. Days were spent in careful observation, watching from concealment as potential victims went about their daily routines. You studied their habits, their schedules, their relationships with others, gathering the intelligence that would make your attack swift and certain. The helots had no way of knowing that death watched them from the shadows, that their normal activities were being catalogued by hunters who viewed them as prey. The state encouraged this killing as both practical population control and psychological conditioning for future soldiers, solving two problems with a single brutal solution. From a practical standpoint, the crypteia helped maintain the demographic balance that kept Sparta's slave-based economy functioning. The systematic elimination of potential leaders and strong individuals helped ensure that the helot population remained manageable. From a psychological perspective, the crypteia completed the transformation of Spartan boys into the kind of men who could kill without hesitation, who could view human life as expendable when it served state's interests. Each year when the ephors took office, they ritually declared war on the helots, allowing Spartans to kill them without risk of ritual pollution or legal consequences. This legal fiction transformed murder into warfare, making the actions of the crypteia technically legitimate under Spartan law. The ritual declaration meant that every helot became an enemy combatant, fair game for elimination by any Spartan who chose to hunt them. This wasn't a declaration of war in the traditional sense, with formal battles and military objectives, but a license for violence that lasted throughout the year. These weren't acts of passion or battle fury driven by the heat of combat or the adrenaline of facing armed opponents. They were calculated killings designed to destroy any remaining empathy in young hearts, to eliminate the last traces of ordinary human compassion that might interfere with military duty. You learn to kill in cold blood, to end a life as calmly as you might butcher an animal for food. The methodical nature of these killings was part of their educational value, teaching young Spartans that death was a tool to be wielded with precision, rather than an emotional experience that might disturb their inner balance. Through the Crypteia, Sparta completed the transformation of children into remorseless killers who could end lives without hesitation, creating men who had proven their loyalty through the ultimate test of obedience. Yet while boys underwent this brutal conditioning that destroyed the last vestiges of their humanity, the state had not forgotten its other young citizens. The same society that demanded such terrible sacrifices from its sons had equally specific plans for its daughters. Picture young girls training alongside boys in the gymnasiums of Sparta, their bodies hardened by exercise, their minds shaped by a different but equally demanding vision of womanhood. The sound of bare feet moving across training grounds echoes through the morning air as they practice wrestling holds and javelin throws under the watchful eyes of instructors who see nothing inappropriate in their athletic pursuits. These girls move with the fluid grace of trained athletes, their muscles defined by years of conditioning, their faces set with the same determined expression that marks their brothers in the agoge. The dust they kick up settles on their skin like a badge of honor, marking them as daughters of a state that valued strength above conventional feminine virtues. Their breathing comes in steady rhythms, controlled and efficient, the result of countless hours spent building the physical foundation that would define their entire lives. While other Greek women lived in seclusion, hidden away in the women's quarters of their homes and rarely seen in public, Spartan girls were trained like athletes, their bodies viewed as essential to producing future warriors. In Athens, girls your age would spend their days learning domestic skills in the shadowy interiors of their family homes, their skin pale from lack of sunlight, their muscles soft from inactivity. They would practice weaving and cooking, preparing for lives of domestic service where their primary value lay in their ability to manage households and bear children quietly. But in Sparta, the state demanded something different from its daughters. You learned to move your body with power and precision, to push yourself beyond the limits that confined other Greek women, to view physical strength as a virtue rather than a threat to feminine modesty. They wrestled, ran, and threw javelins, developing the physical strength needed to bear healthy children who could survive the rigors of Spartan life. The training grounds became your second home, where you grappled with other girls in contests that left you bruised and breathless. You learned to throw the javelin with accuracy, to feel the perfect balance of the weapon in your hand before releasing it toward distant targets. Running became as natural as breathing, your legs carrying you across the training fields with the endurance that would later serve you in the marathon of childbirth. These weren't gentle exercises designed to maintain feminine grace, but serious athletic training that built the kind of robust health the state required from its mothers. Their education included music and poetry through the Musite curriculum, but always with the understanding that their ultimate purpose was motherhood and the production of strong warriors. You learned to sing the ancient war songs, to dance in festivals that celebrated military victories, to recite poetry that glorified heroic death in battle. Your voice carried the melodies that would one day lull your own children to sleep, but the lullabies you learned were filled with tales of courage and sacrifice rather than gentle comfort. You memorized the names of fallen heroes, the stories of mothers who had sent their sons to war with pride rather than tears. Every song, every dance, every poem served to reinforce the values that would guide your future role as a mother of warriors. You were taught to value strength over beauty, duty over personal desire, and the state's needs over your own dreams. While girls in other cities learned to enhance their appearance with cosmetics and jewelry, you learned to appreciate the beauty of muscle definition and physical capability. Your worth was measured not by how well you could attract a husband, but by how effectively you could produce and raise children who would serve Sparta's military needs. Personal preferences about marriage partners, career aspirations, or individual fulfillment were luxuries that the state could not afford to indulge. You learned to find satisfaction in your contribution to the collective rather than in personal achievement or happiness. Marriage for them wasn't about love or companionship, but a breeding arrangement designed to produce the next generation of warriors. The wedding ceremony itself reflected this harsh reality, with its ritualized kidnapping that stripped away any illusion of romantic partnership. You would have your head shaved to the scalp, removing the feminine beauty that might distract from your primary function as a producer of children. Dressed in a man's cloak and sandals, you would lie alone on a mattress in the dark, waiting for a husband who would visit you briefly before returning to his military duties. The bridegroom would slip in after his communal dinner, perform his duty with the same efficiency he brought to military exercises, and then disappear back into the world of male warriors where his true loyalties lay. The state encouraged women to bear as many strong children as possible, leading to marriage customs that might seem strange to other Greeks but served Sparta's demographic needs. You learned that your body belonged not to yourself or even to your husband, but to the state that required a steady supply of future warriors. Some women were expected to bear children by multiple men, their reproductive capacity viewed as a resource to be managed rather than a personal choice to be respected. The constant absence and loss of men in battle created pressure for maximum fertility, while the intense physical inspection of newborns meant that only the strongest children would survive to adulthood. They were expected to send their sons to war without tears and welcome them home on their shields if they died honorably. You learned the famous phrase that Spartan mothers supposedly spoke to their warrior sons: "Come back with your shield or on it." This wasn't cruel indifference, but the ultimate expression of state loyalty, a mother's love transformed into service to the collective good. You practiced controlling your emotions, preparing for the day when you would watch your own children march away to face death in battle. The natural maternal instinct to protect and nurture your offspring was redirected toward pride in their military service and acceptance of their potential sacrifice. Unlike women in other Greek cities, Spartan women enjoyed unusual freedoms that reflected their unique position in society. You were expected to be literate and numerate, skills that served practical purposes in managing household affairs while men were away at war. You learned to speak your mind even in public, engaging with male citizens in ways that would have scandalized other Greeks. This intellectual training and social freedom weren't meant to make you an independent thinker, but to prepare you for the expanded responsibilities that came with being a Spartan woman in a militarized society where men were frequently absent. Spartan girls became women who viewed their own bodies and emotions as tools of the state, not sources of personal fulfillment. You learned to measure your worth by your contribution to Sparta's military strength rather than by personal happiness or individual achievement. Your body became a vessel for producing warriors, your emotions a resource to be managed in service of state needs. The physical training that had strengthened your muscles also strengthened your resolve, creating women who could endure the hardships of military wives and the heartbreak of military mothers. Yet even as these women accepted their roles as mothers of warriors, the boys they raised faced a future that offered no promise of personal freedom. The harsh childhood of the Agoge was merely preparation for decades of continued service, where adulthood brought not independence, but simply a more sophisticated form of state control. The barracks that awaited them at 18 looked remarkably similar to the ones they had left behind, and the faces of their supervisors carried the same cold indifference that had marked their entire existence. At 18, when other young men might start families or careers, Spartan boys simply graduated to a more advanced form of slavery to the state. While your peers in Athens or Corinth were learning trades, inheriting family businesses, or beginning to court potential wives, you found yourself assigned to yet another military unit with yet another set of rigid rules to follow. The transition from boy to man brought no relief from supervision, no relaxation of discipline, no acknowledgement of your individual worth or desires. They couldn't marry, earn property, or make independent decisions about anything that mattered in their lives. The basic human rights that other Greeks took for granted were denied to Spartan men well into their third decade of life. You watched as merchants from other cities spoke of their homes, their wives, their children, their businesses, and you realized that such concepts remained foreign to your experience. The state owned your body, your time, your future, and your very identity. Any possessions you might accumulate were held in trust by the community. Any relationships you formed were subject to military necessity, and any plans you made could be overruled by orders from superior officers who saw you as nothing more than a tool of war. Even their meals were communal, eaten in mess halls called syssitia, where they had to contribute food but couldn't choose what or when to eat. The syssitia became your new prison, a dining arrangement that reinforced your dependence on the collective while denying you the simple pleasure of choosing your own meals. You were required to contribute specific amounts of food to the communal stores, yet you had no say in how that food was prepared or when it would be served. The portions remained deliberately modest, designed to keep you lean and hungry, ready for the deprivations of military campaigns. Each syssitia consisted of about 15 members who formed tight bonds of mutual dependence. But these relationships served military purposes rather than personal fulfillment. Personal relationships were discouraged because emotional bonds might interfere with military duty or create conflicting loyalties that could compromise your effectiveness as a soldier. You learned to maintain emotional distance even from your closest comrades, understanding that attachment was weakness and that the state's needs always came before personal affection. Marriage remained forbidden until age 30, and even then it would be subject to state approval and designed primarily for breeding purposes rather than companionship. The natural human desire for intimate connection was systematically frustrated, replaced by the harsh bonds of military brotherhood that served state purposes. They lived in barracks with other soldiers, their every moment scheduled and supervised by the state. Your daily routine was planned from dawn to dusk, with designated times for training, meals, rest, and even recreation. Privacy was non-existent, personal space was minimal, and the constant presence of other men created an atmosphere of perpetual vigilance. You slept in rooms designed for maximum efficiency rather than comfort, your few possessions stored in simple chests that could be searched at any time. The walls around you were not protection but confinement, keeping you contained within the system that had shaped you since childhood. Any sign of independent thinking or personal ambition was viewed as dangerous selfishness that needed to be crushed before it could spread to other men. The supervisors who watched over you had been trained to identify and eliminate any traces of individual personality that might compromise your value as a soldier. You learned to suppress your own thoughts, to present a facade of perfect conformity while keeping your true feelings buried deep inside. The creative impulses that might have flourished in other environments were systematically starved out of you, replaced by the mechanical responses that military service required. Citizens remained in barracks until age 30, then served in the active reserve until 60, their lives structured around military obligations that left little room for personal development. The homoioi, or equals, as they called themselves, shared a lifestyle that emphasized their subordination to the collective, rather than any genuine equality of opportunity. This supposed equality was really uniformity, a leveling down that prevented anyone from rising above the common standard of disciplined servitude. You were equal in your lack of freedom, equal in your dedication to the state, equal in your willingness to sacrifice individual desires for collective needs. The bonds that held you together were forged not from choice but from shared suffering, creating a brotherhood based on mutual dependence rather than genuine affection. You had been so thoroughly conditioned by the system that alternatives to your current existence seemed not just impossible but undesirable. The thought of making independent decisions filled you with anxiety rather than excitement because you had never learned to trust your own judgment or pursue your own interests. The state had become your identity, its needs your purpose, its goals your only acceptable aspirations. Sparta created adults who had never experienced personal freedom and couldn't imagine life beyond military service. You were a perfectly crafted tool, sharp and durable, designed for a specific function and incapable of imagining any other use. The system had consumed your humanity so completely that you could no longer remember what it meant to be anything else. Yet even this lifetime of servitude was presented as merely preparation for something greater, a promise that would prove as hollow as all the others that had sustained you through decades of sacrifice. At 30, after 2 decades of brutal conditioning, Spartan men finally achieved citizenship, only to discover it was another form of bondage wrapped in the illusion of freedom. The ceremony that marked this transition felt hollow, a ritual that celebrated not liberation, but a more sophisticated form of servitude. You had counted the years, dreamed of this moment when you would finally escape the endless supervision and rigid control that had defined your existence since childhood. Yet as you stood among your fellow new citizens, listening to the formal proclamations and traditional speeches, you realized that the chains binding you to the state had not been broken but merely polished to a brighter shine. The promise of freedom at 30 proved to be largely illusory, with citizenship bringing new responsibilities rather than personal liberation. Instead of the independence you had imagined, you discovered that full citizenship meant assuming greater obligations to the very system that had shaped you. The state that had controlled your childhood, your adolescence, and your young adulthood now expected you to become its willing partner in perpetuating the same harsh discipline on the next generation. You were no longer just a product of the system, but an active agent in its continuation, expected to enforce the same brutal standards that had crushed your own individuality. Even as full citizens, they remained bound by the same communal living arrangements and military obligations that had defined their youth. The barracks that had housed you as a boy were replaced by slightly more comfortable quarters, but the principle remained the same. You still lived according to schedules set by others, still ate meals at times determined by military necessity, still slept in rooms designed for efficiency rather than comfort. The stone walls that surrounded you might have been decorated with the symbols of your new status, but they remained walls nonetheless, defining the boundaries of a life that belonged more to Sparta than to yourself. Spartiate men were permitted marriage and property only after completing their military service, but these privileges came with their own constraints and obligations. The woman who became your wife had endured her own harsh conditioning, learning to see marriage not as a partnership, but as a duty to produce warriors for the state. She looked at you with the same cold assessment that had marked every relationship in your life, measuring your worth by your military record rather than your capacity for love or companionship. The children she would bear would face the same systematic destruction of individuality that had shaped your own childhood, continuing the cycle of service and sacrifice that defined Spartan society. Property ownership existed within strict boundaries, with the state maintaining control over land transactions and inheritance. The house you might own remained subject to inspection and regulation, its contents monitored to ensure they met the austere standards that the state demanded. You could not accumulate possessions that might make you comfortable or allow you to express personal taste or preferences. Even the clothes you wore and the food you ate were regulated by laws that prioritized military readiness over individual satisfaction. The promise of ownership proved to be another illusion, as everything you possessed remained ultimately subject to the state's approval and control. They were expected to continue eating in communal mess halls, maintaining the bonds of military brotherhood above family ties. The syssitia that had controlled your meals as a young soldier continued to dominate your social life as a citizen. You sat at the same long tables, sharing the same simple fare, engaging in the same carefully monitored conversations that had marked your earlier years. The bonds you formed with your messmates were expected to supersede any affection you might develop for your wife or children. Family relationships were viewed with suspicion, as potential sources of divided loyalty that might weaken your commitment to the collective good. Political participation was limited to approving decisions made by elders, with independent political thought discouraged as dangerous to social stability. The assemblies you were now entitled to attend offered only the illusion of democratic participation. You could vote yes or no on proposals brought forward by the Gerousia, but you could not debate the merits of different policies or suggest alternative approaches to the challenges facing your society. The men who made the real decisions were those who had survived the system long enough to achieve positions of authority, and they had no interest in hearing ideas that might threaten the order that had elevated them to power. Their entire identity remained wrapped up in their military role, with no concept of personal fulfillment beyond service to Sparta. The decades of conditioning had been so thorough that you could no longer imagine what it might feel like to pursue your own interests or develop your own talents. The The skills you possessed were all military in nature. The relationships you valued were all based on shared service. And the goals you pursued were all directed towards strengthening the state. Personal happiness had been so thoroughly suppressed that you no longer recognized it as a legitimate aspiration. The very concept of individual fulfillment seemed foreign and dangerous, a threat to the collective harmony that had been drilled into you since childhood. The daily routines that structured your life as a citizen differed little from those that had controlled your youth. You rose at dawn to participate in military exercises, spent your days training younger men in the same harsh disciplines that had shaped you, and retired to your quarters with the same exhaustion that had marked your earlier bacha. Years. The conversations you had with other citizens focused on military matters, state policy, and the proper education of the next generation of warriors. Personal topics were avoided, emotional expression was discouraged, and any sign of individual creativity or independent thought was quickly suppressed. Citizenship revealed itself as simply a more prestigious form of servitude, with freedom remaining forever out of reach. The title you had earned through decades of sacrifice and service proved to be nothing more than a new label for the same old bondage. You were still expected to subordinate your individual desires to collective needs, still required to live according to rules set by others, still denied the basic human rights that citizens in other Greek cities took Sparta for granted. The promise of eventual liberation that had sustained you through the darkest moments of your youth proved to be a cruel deception, designed to motivate compliance rather than reward endurance. The system had succeeded in creating men who were no longer capable of imagining alternatives to their harsh existence, who had internalized the values of their oppressors so thoroughly that they could no longer distinguish between their own desires and the state's demands. You had become a perfect citizen of Sparta, which meant you had ceased to be a complete human being, transformed instead into a tool that served a single purpose with absolute efficiency and unquestioning loyalty. The cost of this transformation would only become clear when measured against everything that had been sacrificed to achieve it. What emerged from this relentless pursuit was a society that had achieved military excellence at the cost of everything else that makes human existence meaningful. As you drift toward sleep tonight, consider the ultimate price of Sparta's quest for the perfect warrior, the complete sacrifice of human childhood, individuality, and joy. The moonlight filtering through your window casts gentle shadows across your room, a soft comfort that those ancient children never knew. You rest in safety, surrounded by the quiet sounds of a world that values your dreams alongside your duties, where strength is admired but not demanded at the cost of everything else that makes life beautiful. The Spartan system succeeded in creating formidable soldiers, warriors whose discipline and courage became legendary across the ancient world, but this achievement came at the price of everything that makes existence worth living. Their military prowess came at the cost of art, literature, philosophy, and the simple human pleasures that other cultures celebrated with festivals, songs, and stories passed down through generations. The relative lack of Spartan literature and inscribed documents compared to other Greek communities speaks to the limits of their educational system. Their children learned to march in formation but never to dance for joy, to recite military commands but never to compose poems about love or wonder. They created a society where strength was the only virtue, where weakness was the only sin, and where human worth was measured solely by military utility. The workshops that should have hummed with creative energy remained silent, their skilled laborers and craftsmen relegated to the periochie, a class of free non-citizens who performed the work that true Spartans considered demona, beneath their dignity. Agriculture and food production fell to the enslaved helots, while the citizens themselves remained focused entirely on the narrow pursuit of military excellence. This division of labor revealed the fundamental weakness in their system, a society that depended on others to provide everything that sustained life while its own people remained trapped in an endless cycle of preparation for twank. War. The children who survived this system were undoubtedly tough, their bodies hardened by exposure and deprivation, their minds focused with laser precision on military objectives. Yet they were also emotionally stunted, intellectually limited, and spiritually hollow, shaped by a system that destroyed the beauty and innocence of childhood in pursuit of martial perfection. You can picture them as adults, standing at attention in their perfectly ordered ranks, their faces marked by the same grim determination that had been carved into them since the age of 7. They knew how to kill efficiently, how to endure pain without complaint, how to follow orders without question. But they had never learned to laugh freely, to create something beautiful, or to find joy in the simple pleasures that make human existence meaningful. Their famous military victories were built on the graves of countless childhoods, each one sacrificed to the god of war that demanded total devotion. The battle formations that struck fear into enemy hearts were composed of men who had never known the warmth of parental love after their 7th birthday, who had never experienced the freedom to choose their own path or pursue their own interests. Every perfectly executed maneuver represented years of childhood spent in barracks rather than homes. Every disciplined charge into battle reflected the systematic destruction of individual dreams, personal aspirations. The price of their military dominance was paid not just by their enemies, but by generations of their own children. The Spartan ideal of the perfect warrior required the complete destruction of the imperfect but beautiful reality of human childhood, the elimination of every soft emotion and gentle impulse that might interfere with military efficiency. They took children who were born with the same capacity for wonder, creativity, and love that fills every human heart, and they systematically stripped away these qualities until nothing remained but the hard core of military discipline. The laughter that should have echoed through their streets was replaced by the rhythmic sound of marching feet. The games that should have sparked imagination were replaced by combat drills. The stories that should have nurtured their souls were replaced by tactical instructions. In pursuing strength above all else, they created a society that was ultimately brittle, unable to adapt or grow beyond its narrow military focus. When the world changed around them, when new forms of warfare emerged, when other Greek cities developed more flexible approaches to defense and diplomacy, Sparta found itself trapped by its own rigid system. The very qualities that had made them formidable in one era became liabilities in another. Their refusal to embrace change, their inability to think creatively about new challenges, their lack of intellectual curiosity about alternatives to their traditional methods, all these limitations stemmed from the same educational system that had produced their military excellence. The manufacturing and agriculture that sustained their society were left to the lower classes, while the citizens themselves remained focused entirely on military preparation. This created a fundamental imbalance that could not be sustained indefinitely. A society that depends on others to provide the basic necessities of life while its own people remain focused on a single narrow skill is inherently unstable. The Spartans became prisoners of their own success, unable to develop the diverse talents and flexible thinking that would have allowed them to thrive in a changing world. The true tragedy of Sparta was not just the suffering it inflicted, but the human potential it destroyed in pursuit of an impossible ideal. The boys who showed signs of creativity or intellectual curiosity were beaten until they learned to suppress these dangerous impulses, leaving the world poorer for their lost contributions. Tonight, as you rest in comfort and safety, remember those long-ago children who never knew such simple pleasures. Your soft pillow, your warm blanket, your freedom to dream whatever dreams fill your sleeping mind. These are luxuries that were denied to countless generations of Spartan youth. You can close your eyes knowing that tomorrow will bring choices, opportunities to pursue your own interests and develop your own talents. The children of Sparta went to sleep each night knowing that every tomorrow would bring more of the same harsh discipline, the same narrow focus, the same denial of everything that makes childhood precious. The system that emerged from this relentless conditioning stands as a stark reminder of what happens when military efficiency becomes the sole measure of human worth. Let the weight of their sacrifice settle gently over you as you drift into sleep, grateful for the childhood you were given and the freedom to dream your own dreams. Sleep well, knowing that your rest is a luxury those ancient children never knew, and that your dreams are yours alone to shape.